Hey there, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are diving into the turbulent waters of geopolitics, specifically the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and its ripple effects across the world stage.
Yeah, it's a really complex situation with so many moving parts. We're going to unpack some thought provoking perspectives about how this conflict is reshaping global power dynamics, from individual leaders' motivations to entire continents' strategies.
Exactly. And one of the most fascinating angles we'll be exploring is the possibility of a deal to end the conflict, an agreement between Putin and the U.S. president. Now, this isn't just a hypothetical scenario, right? We have some intriguing insights into the potential motivations for each leader, what's at stake for them, and even the possibility of a surprise mediator, Saudi Arabia.
Right, the suggestion that Saudi Arabia might step in as a mediator, that's particularly interesting. Think about it. If this does happen, it signifies a potential shift in the traditional power dynamics we're used to seeing on the global stage.
Absolutely. And you have to wonder what kind of concessions might be on the table. We're talking about potentially easing sanctions on Russia, maybe agreements on military bases, even whispers of economic investment opportunities. All of this makes you wonder, what could this mean for the future of Ukraine itself? Will we see a push for autonomy, a rapid economic recovery, or perhaps new international alliances forged in the aftermath? It's a lot to unpack, and the implications are huge.
And speaking of implications, let's turn our attention to Europe. This conflict is happening right on their doorstep, and the impact is undeniable. We're going to dig into the economic ramifications, the potential for a larger European role in global security, and even a rather controversial argument that's been put forward.
Oh, this is where things get juicy. The argument is that some factions in Europe might actually prefer the conflict to continue, and their reasoning is tied to the potential damage it could inflict on the U.S. president's reputation. Now, whether that's true or not is a matter of debate, but it raises some fascinating questions about Europe's motivations and their long-term goals.
It does. Is this conflict pushing Europe to reassess its reliance on the U.S. for security? Are they equipped to take on a larger role? And what would that even look like? We're talking potential challenges, potential consequences, a whole new set of dynamics to consider.
And while all this is happening on the ground, let's not forget the information war that's raging alongside the physical conflict. This is where things get really interesting for me, because we're talking about the power of narratives, propaganda, and media spin. It all boils down to this: how is each side framing the conflict, both to their own people and to the rest of the world?
Exactly. And it's not just about how Russia and Ukraine are presenting their narratives. We also need to examine how external players like the U.S. and Europe are framing the conflict for their own citizens, because these differing narratives directly influence international responses and the level of support each side receives.
And, we've seen some pretty stark examples of potentially misleading or biased information floating around, which highlights the need for all of us to be discerning consumers of news. It's more important than ever to think critically about the sources we rely on and to be aware of potential manipulation or hidden agendas.
Absolutely. We need to be asking, who benefits from this particular narrative? What are their motivations? It's all about peeling back the layers and understanding the bigger picture.
Now, with all that in mind, let's turn our attention back to Ukraine itself. What are the potential outcomes of this conflict for the country? Regardless of how it ends, we're seeing discussions ranging from a negotiated settlement to the possibility of continued fighting, even the potential for partition. It's a lot to take in.
And there are two starkly different futures being painted. One where Ukraine emerges as a kind of Switzerland, neutral and prosperous. The other where it becomes more like Gaza, perpetually unstable and caught in a cycle of conflict. To understand these potential outcomes, we need to dig deeper into the factors that could contribute to one path over the other.
It's fascinating to think about the long-term implications for Ukraine, their economy, their political system, their relationship with Russia. This conflict has the potential to reshape the country in fundamental ways, and we're going to explore those potential transformations.
It's a critical juncture in Ukraine's history, and the choices made now will resonate for generations to come.
And speaking of choices, we can't overlook the role of activists in supporting Ukraine and shaping the global narrative of this conflict. While activism can be a powerful force for change, it's crucial to acknowledge that it can also be harmful or even manipulative. We're seeing alarming examples of what some are calling grooming and cancel culture tactics being used, where dissent is stifled and individuals are pressured to conform to a particular viewpoint.
It's a reminder that good intentions aren't always enough, and activism can sometimes go astray. We need to be wary of anyone claiming to speak for others. especially when their tactics involve intimidation or silencing those who hold different views.
Exactly. This raises an important question for all of us. Who benefits from this activism? What are the potential consequences, both intended and unintended? These are questions we should all be asking ourselves as we navigate this complex landscape.
And finally, let's shift our focus to the internal dynamics within Russia itself. How is this war impacting Putin's hold on power? What does it mean for the future of democracy and human rights within Russia? These are critical questions with ripple effects far beyond Russia's borders.
Absolutely. We're seeing a noticeable crackdown on dissent, with opposition groups facing increasing challenges. There's a real concern that this war, while intended to strengthen Russia's position on the world stage, might actually be having the opposite effect internally, undermining democratic norms and further consolidating Putin's grip on power.
It's a classic case of unintended consequences, and we're going to delve into what this means for the future of Russia's political landscape.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from the possibility of a high-stakes deal to the internal struggles within Russia. But there's another layer to this conflict that we need to unpack, and it's the idea that what we're seeing in Ukraine is in many ways a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia.
That term proxy war has been thrown around quite a bit. So let's take a moment to break down what it actually means. In the simplest terms, it's a conflict where major powers use third parties to fight on their behalf, often indirectly.
So in this case, the argument is that the U.S. and Russia are essentially using Ukraine as a battleground to advance their own interests without directly engaging in open conflict with each other. Is that a fair assessment of what's happening?
Well, it's certainly a perspective that's been put forward, and there's evidence to support it. The U.S. has been providing significant military and financial aid to Ukraine, while Russia has been backing separatist groups in the eastern part of the country.
And this idea of a proxy war has major implications for how we view the conflict.
Right.
It suggests that the stakes are even higher than they might appear on the surface. We're not just talking about a regional conflict, we're talking about a potential clash between global superpowers.
Precisely. If this is indeed a proxy war, then the outcome could have significant consequences for the global balance of power. A decisive victory for one side could embolden them to take a more assertive stance in other regions, potentially leading to a cascade of geopolitical shifts.
And it raises some tough questions about the motivations of the key players involved. Are they genuinely acting in the best interests of Ukraine, or are they primarily concerned with advancing their own agendas? It's a cynical view, but one that we need to consider.
It's a question of realpolitik. Nations often act in their own self-interests, and the pursuit of power and influence can sometimes overshadow other considerations. This doesn't mean that there's no genuine concern for Ukraine, but it does suggest that we need to be realistic about the motivations driving the actions of major powers.
So let's assume for a moment that this proxy war theory holds true. How does it change our understanding of the potential outcomes of this conflict and their implications for the world?
Well, it suggests that a quick and easy resolution is unlikely. Both the U.S. and Russia have a vested interest in seeing their side prevail, and they're likely to continue providing support to their respective allies. This means the conflict could drag on for a considerable amount of time, with all the attendant costs and consequences.
And it also means that any negotiated settlement, even if it's reached between Ukraine and Russia directly, will have to address the concerns of both major powers. It can't just be a bilateral agreement. It has to account for the broader geopolitical dynamics at play.
Absolutely. A lasting peace agreement will need to create a balance of power that is acceptable to both the U.S. and Russia, one that addresses their perceived security concerns and prevents the conflict from flaring up again. This adds another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the role of economic factors in this conflict. It's clear that the economic ramifications are massive, not just for Russia and Ukraine, but for the global economy as a whole. We're seeing disrupted supply chains, rising energy prices, sanctions and counter-sanctions. It's a whole interconnected web of economic pain.
You're absolutely right. The war has thrown the global economy into a state of flux. It's disrupted supply chains for essential goods, leading to shortages and price hikes. The sanctions on Russia, a major energy exporter, have sent shockwaves through global energy markets, causing prices to soar.
And one argument that's been made is that these very economic factors, these painful consequences, could actually play a role in bringing the conflict to an end sooner rather than later. The theory is that the longer the war drags on, the more unsustainable it becomes economically for all the parties involved.
That's a plausible scenario. The economic costs of war are always high, and they tend to increase over time as resources are depleted, infrastructure is destroyed, and trade is disrupted. At some point, the pain of continuing the fight might outweigh the potential gains, pushing the parties toward a negotiated settlement.
We're already seeing the impact on Russia's economy, with sanctions biting hard and the ruble losing value. But Europe is also feeling the pain, especially with rising energy costs and the prospect of a recession looming.
And it's not just about the immediate economic costs. It's about the long-term consequences as well. Prolonged conflict can damage a country's reputation, deter investment, and hinder economic growth for years to come.
So there's a real possibility that economic pressure could force the parties to the negotiating table. But there's also the flip side to consider, isn't there? Economic hardship can sometimes fuel further conflict. If people are struggling to make ends meet, they may be more susceptible to extremist ideologies or more willing to support aggressive action.
That's a valid concern. Economic hardship can breed resentment, instability, and a sense of desperation, which can create fertile ground for conflict. It can also undermine public support for a government, potentially leading to political instability or even regime change.
So it's a complex and uncertain situation. The economic factors could push in either direction, toward peace or toward further escalation.
Exactly. It's a double-edged sword. The economic fallout from this war is something we need to watch closely because it could be a key factor in determining how this conflict ultimately plays out.
So we've been talking about the potential for economic pressures to push for an end to the conflict. But let's imagine for a moment that a deal is actually struck. What might that peace in Ukraine look like on the ground?
Well, one idea that's been floated is Ukraine adopting a neutral status. Kind of like Switzerland, this would mean no NATO membership and possibly limitations on their military capabilities.
So essentially they'd become a buffer state between Russia and the West.
Exactly. The hope is that a neutral Ukraine would ease security concerns on both sides and reduce the risk of future conflict.
But does that really address the root causes of this conflict? I mean, it was Russia that invaded Ukraine, not the other way around.
That's a valid point. And some argue that a neutral Ukraine wouldn't address Russia's underlying security concerns. It might even encourage more aggression down the line.
And what about the people of Ukraine? Would they even accept such a deal? Especially after everything they've been through.
Public opinion in Ukraine is complex and divided, Some might be willing to compromise for the sake of peace, but others would see any concessions to Russia as a betrayal.
It's easy to get lost in the geopolitical maneuvering and forget that real people are at the heart of this. Their voices need to be heard and respected in any lasting peace agreement.
Absolutely. Any sustainable peace must prioritize the aspirations of the Ukrainian people and guarantee their safety and well-being.
Now, beyond Ukraine itself, we've touched on the potential for this conflict to shift global power dynamics. How do you see that playing out?
This conflict has definitely shaken things up on the world stage. We're seeing the emergence of new alliances and partnerships, and old ones are being reevaluated.
One of the most striking shifts is the growing bond between Russia and China. What are the implications of this partnership?
It's a development with serious geopolitical consequences. Both countries share an interest in challenging the dominance of the United States and its allies.
And they're not just talking. They're cooperating on economic and military fronts. Think about the joint military exercises, the energy deals, their coordinated messaging in international forums. It's a powerful alignment.
Exactly. This partnership has the potential to reshape the global balance of power, particularly in Eurasia.
But is this alliance as solid as it seems? Are there any cracks beneath the surface?
Well, despite the outward show of unity, there are underlying tensions and potential points of friction. China, for example, has been careful not to explicitly endorse Russia's actions in Ukraine, and there's a long history of rivalry between the two nations.
So it's a partnership worth watching closely, but maybe not the monolithic block it appears to be.
Right, it's a complex relationship, and it's still evolving. Now, speaking of complex and evolving, we need to address the economic fallout from this conflict, not just for Russia and Ukraine, but globally. We're seeing soaring energy prices, supply chain disruptions, growing concerns about food security. What does this mean for everyday people?
It's hitting people's wallets directly, isn't it? We're all seeing higher prices for basic necessities like food and fuel.
Right, and for many, it could mean having to make tough choices about how to make ends meet.
And this economic pain isn't limited to the countries directly involved in the conflict. It's a global phenomenon.
Absolutely. The global economy is so interconnected that shocks in one part of the world are felt everywhere.
So what are the potential long-term consequences of this economic turmoil?
It's difficult to predict with certainty, but some experts foresee a period of prolonged economic instability. We could be looking at persistent inflation, slower growth, and increased volatility in financial markets.
And this economic uncertainty could spill over into social and political unrest, right? Especially in countries that are already struggling economically.
That's a legitimate concern. Economic hardship can be a breeding ground for social and political upheaval, particularly in countries with weak institutions or deep societal divisions.
So the economic fallout of this conflict is about more than numbers on a balance sheet. It's about people's lives and the stability of the global order.
Exactly. Peace and stability are essential for economic prosperity. And conflict has far-reaching consequences that go well beyond the battlefield.
Now, shifting our focus back to Ukraine, what might a post-conflict Ukraine look like, regardless of how the war ends?
It's a question that's being intensely debated, both within Ukraine and internationally. There are so many variables to consider: the extent of the damage, the political landscape, the level of international support they receive, and, of course, their future relationship with Russia.
One idea that's been floated is a massive reconstruction effort, something along the lines of the Marshall Plan after World War II. Is that even a realistic possibility?
It's a goal many are striving for, but it faces significant hurdles. The destruction is on an immense scale, and the political and security situation remains uncertain. It's hard to attract investment and expertise when the future is so unpredictable.
And there's also the question of who foots the bill for this reconstruction. We've heard calls for Russia to bear the financial burden. But is that a realistic expectation?
It's a contentious issue. Some argue that Russia should be held accountable for the damage it's caused, while others believe that focusing on reparations could actually hinder reconciliation.
Beyond the physical rebuilding, how does Ukrainian society heal from the trauma of this war? How do they address the social and psychological scars?
That's a complex and long-term challenge. This war has inflicted deep wounds, both physical and emotional. It will take significant resources and a long-term commitment to address the needs of everyone who has been affected: veterans, refugees, families who have lost loved ones.
And this healing process needs to happen on multiple levels, right?
Yeah.
Individual, community, and national.
Absolutely. It's not just about rebuilding infrastructure. It's about rebuilding lives, communities, and a sense of shared national identity.
Speaking of national identity, this conflict seems to be reshaping that very concept, both in Ukraine and in Russia.
You're right. The war has certainly intensified feelings of national identity in both countries, but in very different ways. In Ukraine, there's been a surge of patriotism and a fierce determination to defend their sovereignty and independence.
We've seen this reflected in the widespread resistance to the invasion, the mobilization of volunteers, and the passionate defense of Ukrainian culture and language.
It's almost like this conflict has forged a stronger sense of Ukrainian nationhood, uniting them against a common enemy.
But in Russia, the situation seems more complicated. While the government is pushing a narrative of national unity, we're also seeing signs of dissent and a questioning of the official line.
That's true. The war has exposed divisions within Russian society, with some wholeheartedly embracing the government's narrative, while others express skepticism or even outright opposition.
And these divisions could have significant implications for Russia's future.
Absolutely. The war has forced Russia to confront fundamental questions about its place in the world, its identity, and its values.
So while this conflict has intensified feelings of national identity, it's also revealed the fragility and contested nature of those identities, especially in Russia.
It's a good reminder that national identity isn't static. It's constantly evolving and being shaped by historical events, political narratives, and social and cultural forces. And there are concerns that the conflict could spiral out of control, potentially leading to the unthinkable.
The mere possibility of nuclear war is a chilling reminder of how fragile peace is and the catastrophic consequences of such a conflict.
It underscores the urgent need to strengthen nuclear non-proliferation efforts and work towards reducing global nuclear stockpiles. We need to eliminate these weapons before they eliminate us.
This war has also highlighted how social media is being used as a tool of both information and disinformation.
Social media has played a complex and multifaceted role in this conflict. On the one hand, it's been a powerful tool for disseminating information, mobilizing support for Ukraine, and documenting atrocities committed by Russian forces.
On the other hand, we've also seen how social media can be exploited to spread propaganda, disinformation, and hate speech.
It's true. The algorithms used by social media companies can actually amplify these harmful messages, creating echo chambers and exacerbating societal divisions.
So it seems like social media is a double-edged sword in this conflict. We need to be aware of both its potential for good and its potential for harm.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we need to be critical consumers of information, especially on social media. And we need to hold social media companies accountable for the content that spreads on their platforms.
This conflict has also had a chilling effect on cultural exchange between Russia and the West.
Cultural institutions have canceled events featuring Russian artists, and there's been a backlash against Russian culture in general.
It's a worrying trend that could lead to greater isolation and misunderstanding between the two sides.
Cultural exchange is so important for building bridges, fostering empathy, and promoting tolerance and understanding.
We need to resist the urge to demonize entire cultures and continue to engage with Russian artists and intellectuals who oppose the war.
You're right. It's important to remember that culture can transcend political divides, and we should be wary of letting politics dictate who we engage with culturally.
And the impact of the conflict extends to the world of global sports as well.
We've seen Russian and Belarusian athletes banned from competitions, and this has sparked controversy.
Some argue that these bans are necessary to punish Russia and Belarus for their actions, while others believe they're unfair to athletes who have no control over their government's decisions.
The bans highlight the complex relationship between sports and politics. Sports can be used as a tool to promote unity and understanding, but they can also become entangled in political disputes.
This conflict has also rekindled debates about history and memory, particularly the shared history between Russia and Ukraine.
The war has reignited discussions about historical narratives and how they're used to justify actions in the present.
Both Russia and Ukraine have their own versions of history, and these narratives often clash.
The conflict has shown how important it is to have a nuanced understanding of history and the dangers of manipulating the past to serve political agendas.
So how can we promote a more balanced and honest discussion about history?
It starts with encouraging open and honest dialogue about the past. Even when it's uncomfortable, we need to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases and be open to different perspectives.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just about the past. It shapes the present and influences the future.
And on that note, the war in Ukraine has exposed vulnerabilities in another critical area, global cybersecurity.
We've seen a surge in cyber attacks, not only against Ukraine, but also against countries that are supporting Ukraine.
These attacks have targeted critical infrastructure, financial institutions, and government agencies, demonstrating the potential for cyber attacks to disrupt essential services and so chaos.
The war has highlighted just how interconnected the cyber world is and how cyber attacks can have real-world consequences.
So what can we do to bolster cybersecurity in this increasingly volatile digital landscape?
We need to invest in more robust cybersecurity infrastructure, both domestically and internationally.
And we need to strengthen international cooperation to deter cyber attacks and hold those responsible accountable.
Cybersecurity is essential for national and global security, and we need to be prepared for this evolving threat.
Speaking of evolving threats, many are concerned that this conflict could lead to a new era of global instability, with more frequent and intense conflicts erupting around the world.
The war in Ukraine has demonstrated that even in the 21st century, major powers are still willing to use force to achieve their objectives, and that has rattled many people.
It's a wake-up call that peace is not a given, and that we need to redouble our efforts to build a more stable and peaceful world.
What are the prospects for achieving a more stable and peaceful world order?
It's difficult to say, but this conflict has certainly underscored the importance of dialogue, diplomacy, and finding ways to cooperate, even in the midst of disagreements.
We need to find ways to manage competition between nations peacefully and prevent it from escalating into conflict. And that requires building trust, respecting international norms, and finding common ground, even when it's hard.
The war in Ukraine is a stark reminder that peace is not something that just happens. It's something we have to actively work towards every single day.
Well, we've covered an incredible amount of ground in this deep dive, exploring the multifaceted implications of the conflict in Ukraine. It's a complex and ever-evolving situation, and we've only scratched the surface.
It's a conflict with global ramifications, impacting everything from geopolitics and economics to the environment and technology. And it's a reminder that we live in an interconnected world, where events in one part of the world can have a profound impact on us all.
So what does all this mean for you? Whether you're deeply interested in global affairs or just trying to make sense of the headlines, This conflict underscores the importance of staying informed, questioning assumptions, and seeking out diverse perspectives.
Exactly. We can't afford to be passive observers. We need to engage with the world around us, think critically about the information we're consuming, and use our voices to advocate for a more peaceful and just future.
This deep dive has certainly given us a lot to think about. What do you think will happen next? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Connect with us on social media and share your insights.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.